In the heart of the Pilgrim of Sorrow, 3 decks below the command throne, and 17 above the plasma hearts that drive her through the dark, sits a chamber no larger than a confessional booth. Corroded ribs curve like the bones of some ancient beast, wrapped in cabling and prayer strips. Here, beneath adamantine bulkheads that have weathered the screams of 100 translations, Tech Adept Vex 77 drags a studded thumb across a strip of vellum, presses it to an access cowling, and whispers the names of screws as if they were saints. A candle burns in a safety cage, its flame not wax, but sanctioned tallow rendered from livestock, blessed by the ecclesiarchy, and tithed by agri-worlds whose names appear only in ledgers. The smoke clings to every surface, to the brass housings of harmonic resonators, to the parchment seals that declare each component pure in the eyes of the Omnissiah, to Vex 77's scarred knuckles as he marks another purity seal across a humming coil. The oil smoke is not incidental theatre. It carries particulate that dampens electrostatic interference in the field harmonics, a discovery made by accident in the old night and preserved by ritual ever since. What began as piety has become engineering. What endures as engineering has been sanctified as piety. The hum fills the chamber. It is both sound and instruction. Keep this, and the world stays. This is the Gellar sanctum. This is where reality holds its breath. The Imperium of Man does not travel the stars so much as it carries a bubble of tolerable reality through a sea that wants it dead. The warp is not distance, it is appetite. Between every embarkation and every arrival, there is a bargain struck, a shell of ordered physics stretched taut around a hull, charged by coils, guided by auguries, guarded by litanies hammered into laboring machine spirits until they learn to fear the dark. The Gellar field is a membrane of borrowed sanity, the smallest stronghold of reality, maintained by habit and hazard in equal measure. 26,000 ships translate daily across the Imperium's breadth. Each carries its own sanctum, its own candle, its own tech adept marking seals, with fingers that shake not from age, but from the weight of what they protect. The mathematics are simple. Fail once, lose everything. The practice is simpler still. Do not fail. Yet failure is not aberration. It is accounted for in ledgers kept by the administratum, in casualty projections filed by the monitorum, in the prayers whispered by navigators who have seen what waits in the spaces between spaces. Mechanically, the Gellar field is a project of synchronization and refusal. Warp-rated generators drink from the plasma heart and invert that power into a shroud. Harmonics are trimmed and trimmed again until their edges do not catch on the currents outside. The field does not push the warp away, so much as convince it that the ship is not of interest. A trick of presence, ritual as camouflage. Thus, Adeptus Mechanicus loves it because a thing that obeys law can be taught, and a thing that must be taught can be owned. The ecclesiarchy loves it because it accepts liturgy without arguing. The navy loves it because without it, there is no navy. The cult Mechanicus treats these generators as sacred relics, their intricate circuits and sub-warp coils understood through doctrine and dogma as much as empirical observation. Engine seers spend entire lifetimes tending these pulsating heart engines, speaking of machine spirits, of propitiating the field's essence with unguents and incantations, of harmonizing output with the beat of the ship's plasma reactors. This is not mere superstition. It is calculated necessity. In the 41st millennium, the line between technology and theology, has blurred into non-existence. Every purity seal affixed, every litany chanted, every drop of sacred oil applied, represents a desperate attempt to ensure that the delicate balance of reality within the ship remains unbroken. This documentary will dissect that mechanism. We will trace what the field is, how it is fed, where it thins, and what that failure does to bodies, to command structures, to the policies that govern who lives and who is written into ledgers as acceptable loss. Our approach is ethnographic. We will treat the 41st millennium not as mythology, but as a lived system, examining institutions as they function rather than as they are proclaimed to function. We will center human cost while acknowledging the logic that makes such cost seem reasonable to those who calculate it. Our lenses will slide across 3 scales: macro, the supply cathedrals that issue coils and incense by the ton, the edicts that convert caution into treason; meso, the doctrines of the mechanicus that permit maintenance by people who do not entirely understand the machines they serve, the navy orders that prioritize secrecy over succor; micro, 1 ship, 1 corridor, 1 minute that lasts forever. The Pilgrim of Sorrow serves as our case study. She is a dictator-class mass conveyor, 47,000 souls aboard, carrying grain and pilgrims to feed a distant war. Her maintenance waiver is pending, bureaucratic language meaning her Gellar field generators have been pushed past recommended operational cycles, her harmonic resonators recalibrated with components cannibalized from other ships, her blessed oils cut with industrial substitutes. She departs because the war will not wait for proper maintenance, because the tithe must be paid, because the alternative to acceptable risk is unacceptable delay. Vex 77 distrusts smooth readings and prides himself on the honesty of a slightly ragged hum. He has replaced 3 harmonic coils, with parts bearing different makers' stamps, making them agree through shims, wire, and a prayer he cannot cite to canon. He keeps a waxed booklet of deviation tolerances inside his robe, his own limits marked on the inside cover in pencil. His job is to keep the hum in memory. If it shifts, he will know before any dial does. Above, in the navigator's tower, Madame Vex Corvain opens her 3rd eye and begins plotting a course through hell. Below, in the habdecks, 32 souls in Red Corridor 19 settle into their bunks, unaware that their section appears on certain charts with notation translating, in the cold language of contingency planning, as expendable if necessary. They do not know, because they do not need to know. The Imperium functions on rationed knowledge, as carefully distributed as blessed oils or sanctioned tallow. But questions linger in the sanctum, even when the hum is good, when the membrane tears and time turns viscous. Who signs the order that condemns a corridor to empty space? The captain commands the ship. The magos commands the machines. The confessor commands hearts. In quiet hours, their responsibilities do not collide. In the minute that matters, signatures cannot overlap. A second question whispers when the sanctum door is shut and the hum is health itself. What happens to those who live through a breach? They are rare. Statistics call them outcomes when forms are filled honestly. The forms do not travel far. The living do, sometimes, to places where words are peeled from minds like paint from old metal. More often, they return to duty with new oaths and fewer friends. Survivors complicate doctrine. Doctrine prefers clean edges and sealed edges both. Halfway through our examination, we will walk with the Pilgrim's crew through 3 minutes that feel like forever. Minutes when the Gellar field fails, when reality becomes negotiable, when the careful distance between warp and real space collapses into intimacy. No human mind was meant to endure. We will see how training holds, how command fractures, how the machinery of survival grinds forward, even when survival itself becomes uncertain. The candle burns lower. Wax creeps like a glacier around the wire cage. Vex 77 pinches it out with wetted fingers, wiping soot onto a rag that smells of resin and human salt. He keeps the hum under his tongue like a prayer bead, as shift whistles blow in distant compartments. Somewhere a navigator sits head-bound in a chamber that pretends to be a chapel to hide that it is a weapon. For now, the field holds. The ship is a candle carried across a vast room by a tired hand. It is enough until it is not. Who holds authority when physics goes on strike? The captain, the magos, or something older? And what becomes of those who step out of the breach alive? Survivors are not merely rare. They are problematic. We will return to their fate. A starship is not a vehicle. It is a city welded into a coffin, a parish bolted to a foundry, a monastery that manufactures its own unquiet prayers. The Pilgrim of Sorrow stretches 40 kilometers from prow to stern, her adamantine spine ribbed with buttresses that house plasma conduits and lined with shrines where shift workers pause to genuflect before machine altars. This is not metaphor. In the 41st millennium, survival demands that every vessel function simultaneously as transport and temple, workplace, and penitentiary, governed by overlapping jurisdictions that transform mere existence into sacrament. Understanding the Gellar field requires first comprehending the civilization it protects. 47,000 souls inhabit the pilgrims' corridors and chambers, their lives measured not in years, but in shifts, their purpose defined not by aspiration, but by function. They exist within a trinity of roles that define imperial starship culture. The vessel as city, as parish, and as workhouse, each aspect reinforcing the others in a web of dependencies that makes rebellion not merely treasonous, but physically impossible. As a city, the Pilgrim divides into districts as rigid as any Hive world's castes. The command spire houses Captain Mordian Vex's throne room, its walls lined with parchment rolls bearing the articles of navigation, edicts that carry the weight of law, scripture, and operational manual combined. Here, death warrants are signed with the same stylus used for supply requisitions, because in the void, the distinction between logistics and mortality dissolves into administrative efficiency. The bridge crew speak in whispers, not from reverence, but from acoustic necessity. Machine spirits interpret raised voices as discord, and discord invites malfunction. 3 decks down, the navigator's sanctum occupies a sphere of blessed adamantine, its walls inscribed with hexagrammic wards that serve purposes both spiritual and practical. Lady Navigator Korvaxa sits in a throne that doubles as life support, her third eye bound with blessed silk when not in use. Her quarters are sealed not for privacy, but for containment. The warp site that charts courses through the immaterium is a controlled mutation that must be isolated, lest it bleed into the ship's population. The chamber pretends to be a chapel to hide that it is a weapon, or perhaps pretends to be a weapon to hide that it is a tomb. Below the command levels, the Engineerium Cathedral spans 7 decks, its nave dominated by plasma reactors that serve as both power source and object of worship. Tech adepts tend machinery, they understand, through ritual rather than theory, their knowledge preserved in cant mechanicus and binary hymns passed down through generations of initiates. The machine spirits that inhabit these systems require propitiation through incense, unguents, and precisely timed litanies. A missed prayer can mean fluctuating power output. A mispronounced canticle might trigger safety lockdowns that take hours to clear. As a parish, every significant passage bears litanies and blessings. Every bulkhead displays icons of the Emperor's watchful gaze. Confessor Matthias Vex Corvain moves through the decks hearing confessions, delivering sermons on duty and sacrifice, and overseeing the myriad daily rituals that reinforce obedience and stifle dissent. Fear of the emptiness beyond the hulls serves as a potent spiritual tool. The crew understands that their collective faith is as vital to the ship's function as the output of her plasma reactors. Heresy is not merely spiritual failing, but material threat, capable of inviting disaster as surely as a ruptured fuel line. The habdecks stack above and below in long galleries, where families sleep in rationed bunks, their privacy bought with shift rotation. Mess lines snake past reusable sermon plates that display rotating litanies while slop is ladled. Obedience is physics. Doubt is entropy. Tighten your harness before prayer. On bulkheads, chalk arrows point toward safe rooms, and, more often, toward rumor. Salt lines at thresholds serve both superstition and hygiene. They prevent condensate from spreading along deck seams and bridging contacts. As a workhouse, every soul aboard has designated function, a cog in the vast machine. From the navigator cloistered in her sanctum to the lowest deck scrubber, life's rhythm is dictated by the vessel's needs and the mechanicus's dictates. Shifts run long, conditions often harsh, and idleness constitutes sin against the machine spirit. The ship does not merely carry cargo. She is cargo, a living instrument of the Imperium's will. Authority aboard divides into overlapping jurisdictions that create tension during normal operations and potential catastrophe during crisis. The captain's articles grant ultimate secular command, power of life and death, final say in discipline and strategic direction. Yet the Adeptus Mechanicus maintains treaty rights, granting tech priests autonomy over sacred machinery. They speak of machine spirits and arcane schematics, often clashing with the captain's pragmatic demands. The ecclesiarchy asserts moral and spiritual authority, its chaplains capable of instigating purges or demanding penance. Overarching all these are naval edicts on quarantine, cold directives that dictate the fate of any vessel suspected of warp contamination, representing the Imperium's ultimate defense. Sacrifice the few to protect the many. This intricate web forms the ship's social compact. Obedience is not virtue, but physical necessity, a component of the physics that keep the ship alive. Faith is not spiritual comfort, but critical maintenance, appeasing machine spirits and ensuring crew compliance. When seconds matter and doctrine demands consensus, overlapping authority becomes overlapping paralysis. The navigation pipeline governing warp travel operates through 3 carefully orchestrated stages. Translation plunges the vessel into the warp, shedding comfortable physics for the immaterium's unpredictable currents. Traverse requires navigation of this psychic ocean, performed by mutant navigators whose third eye perceives the Astronomicon across impossible distances. Emergence claws back into real space with the shuddering violence of birth. Thor, astropathic choir, serves as communications clergy, their minds fragile bridges between distant stars, their isolation necessary psychic quarantine. The ship employs different species of protection for distinct threats. Void shields deflect physical dangers, lasfire, plasma bolts, kinetic impacts, creating barriers of controlled energy that absorb and redirect attacks. They protect the hull from measurable, repairable damage. Gellar fields protect something more fundamental, reality's integrity within the ship's boundaries. They do not deflect warp energy, so much as convince it that the ship exists in a different state of being, a bubble of ordered physics drifting through chaos without attracting attention. Seemingly minor details gain profound significance within this framework. The calibrated incense blends permeating the pilgrim's sanctums are not merely spiritual cleansing. Specific grades and compositions, formulated by mechanicus alchemists, generate particulate clouds whose electrostatic properties help stabilize Gellar field harmonics. What presents as devotional act is simultaneously crucial engineering input, ritual and technology rendered indistinguishable. The Pilgrim of Sorrow sails with a pending maintenance waiver, bureaucratic language meaning her Gellar field generators operate beyond recommended cycles, because war demands constant supply runs, and dockyards cannot accommodate every ship needing proper maintenance. Components have been cannibalized from other vessels, their compatibility certified through prayers rather than technical specifications. Sacred oils have been cut with industrial substitutes, maintaining viscosity while reducing blessed content. These represent not system failures, but features. Acceptable degradation in service of acceptable risk. Red Corridor 19 exemplifies this calculated efficiency. 32 souls occupy what was originally designed as storage bay, their hammocks strung between structural supports that double as cargo netting anchor points. The corridor appears on 3 different ship plans, as passenger accommodation on Ecclesiarchy manifests, as secondary storage on Munitorum cargo lists, and as expendable volume on damage control schematics locked in the captain's safe. The inhabitants know only the first designation. The ship operates on rationed knowledge as carefully distributed as blessed oils or recycled air. Information flows through established channels according to need-to-know protocols, treating ignorance as protection. The crew knows enough to perform duties. Passengers know enough to remain compliant. Officers know enough to make decisions. No one knows everything, because everything includes knowledge that would make the mission impossible if widely distributed. She departs because delay is not an option in the Imperium's war economy. Tithes must be paid on schedule, supply lines maintained. The alternative to acceptable risk is unacceptable failure to meet obligations, cascading through sector-wide logistics networks. The Pilgrim carries grain that will feed guard regiments whose survival depends on regular resupply. The mathematics are simple. Risk 47,000 souls to preserve millions more. Why does a ship with a pending waiver depart? The ledgers will explain the arithmetic of empire, the calculated exchange of lives for logistics that keeps the Imperium functioning across impossible distances. The navigator's isolation is safety. Until it isn't. We will enter that sanctum later, when physics breaks down and isolation becomes the only barrier between sanity and something that wears familiar faces while speaking in voices that know too much. A Gellar field is not a wall. It does not roar with defiance or stand rigid against the storm. It persists, A membrane of borrowed sanity stretched taut around 47,000 souls, humming with the desperate mathematics of survival. The field's purpose is refusal made manifest, a sheath of ordered law that convinces the immaterium this hull does not concern it. Understanding how such a thing lives requires abandoning the distinction between engineering and theology, between maintenance and prayer. In the 41st millennium, they are facets of the same discipline, practiced by different orders of the same faith. The field begins with plasma fire, burning in the ship's deepest sanctums. The Pilgrim of Sorrow's reactors consume stellar matter, contained within magnetic bottles, blessed by tech priests, and monitored by servitors whose lobotomized minds cannot doubt the machine spirits they serve. This raw power feeds through consecrated conduits to field inverters, massive crystalline matrices that perform a transformation, both technical and metaphysical. They do not simply convert energy, they invert it, creating power that exists in fundamental opposition to the warp's chaotic nature. The process generates heat, radiation, and a subsonic vibration that experienced crew learn to read like scripture. From the inverters, this inverted energy flows to projectors arranged throughout the ship's superstructure according to sacred geometries derived from ancient STC patterns. Each projector, the size of a HAB unit and wrapped in prayer scrolls, creates overlapping fields that merge into a single protective envelope. The thermal bleed from this process serves dual purposes. Heat dissipation prevents the generators from melting their own housings, while the specific thermal signature helps tech adepts diagnose field integrity hours before automated systems register problems. Sacred oils applied to generator housings burn at precise rates, their smoke carrying prayers to machine spirits while creating particulate clouds that dampen electromagnetic interference in the coils. The hum is both diagnostic tool and spiritual comfort. When functioning properly, the field generates a subsonic vibration at exactly 23.7 Hz, a frequency that human nervous systems interpret as reassuring rather than threatening. Crew members unconsciously synchronize their breathing to this rhythm during sleep cycles. The hum is not a single tone, but a chord, phase-managed across multiple generators, so their peaks and troughs never conspire to thin the membrane in one place. When the frequency shifts, even by fractions, experienced personnel notice immediately through teeth and arm hair, before any auspex registers deviation. Harmonics govern everything. The field lives only as long as its component frequencies maintain precise relationships calculated through formulae that blend mathematics with numerology. A deviation of 0.03% in harmonic resonance creates weak points where the warp bleeds through. A deviation of 1% tears holes that swallow entire sections. Small ripples pass unnoticed by auspex. Sensors love averages. The warp loves edges. Thin places begin as fractions of a degree and fractions of a second. Condensation appearing where it should not. Copper taste creeping into recycled air. At the field's heart lies the septuple resonance array. 7 generator clusters arranged in sacred geometry that the Adeptus Mechanicus treats as divine revelation. Each cluster contains 3 primary generators, 2 backup units, and 17 harmonic modulators that fine-tune output to match warp conditions. The clusters are positioned at distances calculated in ratios of 7, angles derived from the Emperor's sacred numerology, power distribution following formulae that work without being understood. This arrangement creates harmonic interference patterns that confuse warp entities, making the ship appear less interesting to predators that hunt by detecting ordered thought or concentrated emotion. The array's sacred geometry is survival disguised as superstition. When all 7 clusters maintain perfect synchronization, geometric relationships create a reality bubble extending 2 kilometers beyond the ship's hull. Within this space, physics operates according to familiar laws. Gravity points down. Time flows forward. Cause precedes effect. When synchronization fails between clusters, the geometric relationships collapse, and the ship broadcasts its presence like a beacon to things that hunt in the spaces between spaces. The sacred mathematics that protect also constrain. Adjustments must follow specific formulae. Repairs must maintain blessed ratios. Emergency procedures must observe ritual requirements, even when time measures in seconds. Work is the counterspell against entropy. Duty rosters pin eyes to gauges and ears to the hum. Watch bills cross-training against fatigue that kills as surely as ignorance. Incense grades distribute by chart according to technical requirements disguised as spiritual preferences. Material purity blend 7 for projectors contains metallic particulates that stabilize electromagnetic fields. Blend 9 for inverters includes crystalline compounds that absorb excess thermal radiation. The ecclesiarchy provides these compounds through supply chains that treat chemistry as theology, ensuring purity through prayer rather than analysis. Calibration wheels turn to prescribed clicks, never freehand, always counted aloud with response lines using the same syllables predecessors used. Ritual makes human error predictable, and predictable error can be planned for. Auspex logs record field integrity through measurements that blend scientific data with religious interpretation. Harmonic resonance appears alongside purity assessments. Temperature readings share pages with spiritual evaluations of machine spirit contentment. The logs serve both technical and legal functions, providing diagnostic information while creating documentation that satisfies administratum requirements for proper ritual observance. Meet Junior Engenseer Heth, representative of thousands who maintain systems they understand through ritual rather than theory. His grease-smeared rosarius contains prayer beads, corresponding to specific litanies required during harmonic adjustments. He learned his coils by touch because the diagram smudged years ago, and no one dared redraw it. Heth counts by thumb on rosarius beads as he eases a phase wheel through quarter turns, lips repeating the litany of alignment, because it keeps time, and because machine spirits expect familiar cadences. He favors a slightly roughened hum. Honest, he calls it, over the glassy smoothness that might indicate tampering or component failure, masked by artificial stabilization. His augmetic left hand detects temperature variations of 0.1 degrees through direct contact with generator housings. He trusts memory over instruments on bad days, keeping a scrap of paper beside panels with his own deviation limits penciled in, tighter than the book's tolerances, because books are written by people who do not live with the consequences of their margins. Heth has heard whispers of devices that smooth harmonic readings without corresponding power draw, contraband stabilizers that promise efficiency while delivering something else entirely. The audit economy reveals the gap between doctrine and practice. Officially, Each Gellar field requires comprehensive inspection every 3 months, with full component replacement annually. Reality intervenes. Supply shortages extend replacement cycles to 18 months. Combat deployments delay audits indefinitely. Emergency repairs use whatever components reach hand, rather than those specified in sacred schematics. The Pilgrim's last full audit occurred 14 months ago. Her next is scheduled for completion when operational requirements permit. Bureaucratic language meaning never, unless she breaks down completely. Redundancy exists primarily on parchment. Each cluster contains backup generators rated for full output, but these backups often serve as spare parts, sources for primary units. Emergency power routing can, theoretically, maintain field integrity with 3 clusters offline. But such routing requires manual intervention by tech priests, who may not survive the conditions requiring such measures. Bypass lines snake behind bulkheads. Proof of crises long survived, their insulation cracked and rewrapped with whatever tape came to hand. The array's sacred geometry maintains itself with shims and compromise, 6 true circles and 1 ellipse that insists on being good enough. There exists a cold start litany locked behind tri-seal authorization, a reset procedure designed to tear a field down and claw it back mid-translation. Its existence proves that doctrine concedes failure while demanding impossible precision. The procedure requires signatures from Captain, Magos, and Confessor, plus a sequence of words that must be right the first time, because there is no second time. No one rehearses it aloud. The chain of command treats that knowledge like live munitions, necessary, dangerous, never left unattended. Official documentation lists mean time between catastrophic field failure as statistically negligible, bureaucratic language that performs sedation at scale. The phrase appears in every sector briefing, its mathematics folding in jettison drills and scuttle protocols as mitigations rather than losses. Confidence bands exclude the undocumented, the quietly vented, ships that translate and never emerge, distress signals speaking in voices of the long dead. Survivorship writes the statistics, rumor writes the warnings that navigator houses maintain in private tables, disagreeing with Navy briefs by margins that matter. The field lives by attention and habit, feeding on counted clicks and measured breaths, incense smoke and tightening bolts, the discipline of people who have learned that piety is a better metronome than fear. It persists through the marriage of ancient technology and desperate ritual, a reality sheath maintained against impossible odds by people who understand that their collective faith is as vital as plasma output. The hum is good today. The paper says redundancy suffices. The quotas say sale now, service later. But statistics buckle under quotas when supply chains cannot provide components fast enough, when maintenance schedules compress under operational demands, when the machinery of empire prioritizes movement over safety. The septuple array is the line between song and scream. What happens when sacred geometry breaks under pressure? When synchronization fails not from malice, but from the simple arithmetic of insufficient resources applied to infinite need. Statistically negligible, to whom? We will open the ledger and examine how the Imperium's war economy transforms acceptable risk into inevitable failure, how the rites of certainty become rituals of denial, and why ships like the Pilgrim sail with pending waivers and prayers substituting for proper maintenance. Uncertainty is treated as a contaminant aboard an Imperial ship. The Mechanicus names it error, the Ecclesiarchy names it doubt, the Navy names it risk. Each institution prescribes its own solvent, but the active ingredient remains constant. Repetition. Where schematics are lost, rubrics stand in their place. Where instruments lie, litanies hold a beat that human hands can follow. Ritual is the technology that stabilizes people long enough to stabilize machines. Tech priest Magos Dacriel Omicron oversees the pilgrim's sacred machinery, with augmetic eyes that interpret heat signatures as prayer patterns and electromagnetic fluctuations as the breath of machine spirits. His flesh has been systematically replaced over 4 decades of service. Left arm traded for a multi-limb mechadendrite assembly, capable of adjusting 17 different controls simultaneously. Organic larynx replaced with a vox grill that chants binary cant at precisely the frequencies that soothe temperamental generators. Servo skulls orbit his augmetic frame like mechanical cherubs, each containing blessed circuitry programmed with specific diagnostic routines. One monitors thermal output, another tracks harmonic resonance, a third maintains count of ritual observances completed during each shift. The skulls serve dual functions, technical assistance and spiritual witness, ensuring no sacred procedure occurs without proper documentation. The cult Mechanicus codifies this as doctrine through the Doctrina Malum, which declares variability a heresy of matter. Engine seers learn the 87 confirmed responses, binary catechisms that replace questions with pathways: query, acknowledge, perform, verify, affix, attest. Machine script rubrics are carved where labels once lived, transforming technical specifications into theological imperatives. A valve becomes not valve 19b, but gate of denial, third aspect, invoked with correct syllables, because correct syllables keep timing predictable across generations of operators who understand function without comprehending principle. Purity seals proliferate because seals are easier to distribute than spare parts. Each seal represents multiple documents compressed into wax and vellum. Technical certification, spiritual blessing, legal indemnity, inventory record. A cracked housing acquires a scroll declaring its continued sanctity. Rewrapped insulation receives devotional lacquer attesting to proper ritual observance. The audit economy transforms every maintenance action into sacrament requiring documentation that satisfies Mechanicus doctrine, administratum regulation, and naval procedure simultaneously. Seals create paper trails that protect tech priests from blame when systems fail. If the ritual was observed correctly, the failure must originate elsewhere. The rites of ignition illustrate this union of law and function perfectly. Before any generator accepts load, prescribed prayers must be recited at measured cadence, while junior acolytes read checklists aloud. Each response, so, witnessed, is stamped onto vellum, then onto slate, then into ledgers. These layered attestations form indemnity chains. The ritual was observed, the machine spirit was appeased, therefore error lies elsewhere. Rites reassure engines while protecting officiants from consequences of inevitable mechanical failure. Commissariat oversight adds another layer of control through Commissar Vex Thane, whose ledgers record faith infractions alongside mechanical faults. Doubt in a sermon tallies against a unit like a cracked gasket, tallies against a manifold. This is not metaphor, but management. Morale fails as predictably as seals, and must be replaced with equivalent austerity. A tech adept questioning established procedures faces discipline, not just for unprofessional behavior. but for insulting machine spirits, crimes that escalate to techno-heresy charges. The commissariat treats doubt as contagion requiring quarantine before it spreads to other personnel. Hidden within restricted archives lies the Cold Start Litany, emergency procedure for restarting Gellar field generators, mid-translation when the ship exists partially within the warp, and normal physics cannot be trusted. The litany represents Mechanicus doctrine at its most desperate and honest, abandoning normal safety protocols to force field generators into activation using power levels that may destroy them. Success depends not just on technical execution, but on spiritual purity. Machine spirits traumatized by warp exposure may refuse commands from operators they perceive as corrupted. The Cold Start requires tri-seal authorization, signatures from Captain, Magos, and Confessor applied within breaths of each other, followed by 9-part recitation whose cadence must not slip. Each voice anchors a piece of the pattern. Each role bears responsibility for consequences that may include damnation of everyone aboard. The captain commands the ship, but lacks technical expertise to evaluate Mechanicus procedures. The Magos understands sacred machinery, but serves the Omnissiah rather than imperial command structure. The Confessor guards spiritual purity, but may view desperate measures as invitations to heresy. This creates the fundamental paradox of imperial authority. The Tri-Seal exists to prevent hasty decisions that might damn the ship through spiritual contamination, but its requirements create delays that may damn the ship through mechanical failure. In fracture minutes, when the warp bleeds through failing fields and reality becomes negotiable, Tri-Seal time is blood time. Precious seconds spent on authorization, while catastrophe accelerates beyond human control. No one rehearses the Cold Start aloud, because speaking the words incorrectly inoculates the ship against the correct ones. Instead, command rehearses logistics, who carries which keys, which corridors are cleared by which squads, what phrasing compels a confessor to sanction death in time. The captain practices opening seals with blood-slick fingers. The Magos practices igniting coils with Rosarius caught in sleeves. The confessor practices deciding between damnation and destruction. Junior Tech Adept Vex 77 embodies this philosophy in daily rounds through the Gellar Sanctum. He performs duties through muscle memory refined over years of repetition, augmetic fingers finding controls by touch, while organic eyes track readings interpreted through pattern recognition rather than comprehension. He trusts rights because rights produce results, and results matter more than reasons in a galaxy, where curiosity kills more surely than ignorance. The rights of certainty create illusion of control through systematic elimination of variables that cannot be controlled. Uncertainty is sin, because acknowledging limits invites humility, and humility leads to questioning, and questioning leads to doubt, and doubt leads to heresy. The Mechanicus prefers ritual to understanding, because ritual can be perfected, while understanding reveals only deeper mysteries. The Imperium of Man is not wealthy. It is vast, and vastness demands an economy of risk, where every component, every life, every moment of transit becomes currency in a cosmic ledger that trades present necessity against future catastrophe. The Pilgrim of Sorrow represents more than transport. She is a line item in calculations that span sectors, her departure authorized not by safety assessments, but by arithmetic that prices 47,000 souls against millions who will starve if supply lines falter. Sector tithes drag ships past safe operational cycles because war accommodates no maintenance schedules. At Port Sanctis, the primary supply hub serving 17 systems, a triage board assigns colors to hulls awaiting refit with the clinical efficiency of battlefield surgeons. Green, doctrinally safe. Amber, fly with caution. Red, pray fast. The board tracks not righteousness, but throughput, measuring ship days against strategic necessity. A Dictator-class mass conveyor burns 26 ship days for full Gellar overhaul. Time that a squadron flagship demands now, plus components, plus the benediction of priority seals. The Pilgrim yields her place in the queue. Her septuple array loses a coil to a battle cruiser whose tactical value outweighs her own. Her backup generators become spare parts donors. Her audit date slides from quarterly to indeterminate. Form 77 Theta. Temporary variance approval, carries 9 endorsements and a stamped prayer attesting to minimal deviation, bureaucratic language that transforms dangerous decisions into defensible paperwork. The waiver exists in triplicate across 3 filing systems, ensuring responsibility remains diffuse enough to avoid specific blame assignment. Component lifespans extend by decree rather than engineering. A projector ring rated for 6 translations receives red ink annotation. Recertified for 4 more by authority of supply Deficit Edict 19. The ring has not grown stronger. The paper has. Tech adepts sign with reluctance and relief, understanding that refusal constitutes sabotage, while compliance provides legal protection when systems inevitably fail. Components serve past design limits, their housings patched with wire, their seals preaching perseverance to metal that remembers its original specifications. Sacred oils receive industrial cutting agents that maintain viscosity while reducing blessed content by 30%. Green incense burns in sanctums throughout the ship, its traditional formulation requiring rare minerals from shrine worlds replaced with synthetic compounds that approximate electromagnetic properties while costing half as much to produce. The specific particulate composition crucial for dampening field interference becomes diluted, replaced by inert fillers that smell similar but lack desired function. Tech adepts compensate by burning more, hoping quantity can substitute for lost quality while introducing new problems. Increased build-up fouls filters. Industrial compounds accelerate corrosion in delicate sensor arrays. Navigator houses pay their own tax in lucidity and sanity. Lady Navigator Corvaxa serves her 4th consecutive translation cycle without prescribed rest, her third eye showing stress fractures that healers treat with stimulants rather than recuperation. Lucid intervals between translations compress from weeks to days, forcing navigation by instinct rather than careful calculation. The houses send substitutes when possible, bill premiums when not, and notarize every deviation while understanding that imperial demand grows faster than bloodline reproduction allows. Where formal supply fails, shadow networks bloom under banners that discourage questions. Ecclesiarchy freighters deliver reliquaries, and, tucked amid crates of blessed candles, pallets of sanctified spares whose provenance traces to rogue factorums operating under clerical cover. Components arrive wrapped in scarlet cloth, stitched with scripture, their invoices listing them as processional equipment, while their specifications match no Navy catalogue. The Pilgrim carries such a secret. Before departure, a contraband harmonic stabilizer found its way aboard through the channels that officially do not exist, installed during night shift, when fewer observers might note deviations from standard procedure. The device promises to smooth harmonic drift by anticipating fluctuations and counter-phasing them. Elegant efficiency, wearing a pious face. Its documentation bears forged purity seals and fabricated blessing certificates, but performance specifications match or exceed approved equivalents. Tech adept Vex77 installed it, with augmetic fingers that detect wrongness through touch, reasoning that machine spirits care more about results than provenance. The stabilizer hums with subtle dissonance that experienced ears notice but choose not to investigate. It eliminates characteristic variations in output that indicate healthy mechanical tolerance, producing readings so consistent they suggest either perfect calibration or sophisticated deception. Smoothness becomes suspicious to those who understand that authentic Imperial technology operates with honest roughness, slight fluctuations that prove systems function rather than merely appear to function. Crew compensation operates through scrip and absolution rather than traditional wages. Personnel receive ration chits, hab allocations, and spiritual credits applicable toward penance reduction or blessing purchases. Risk becomes their wage, hazard pay calculated in prayer tokens, and salvation promises rather than thrones. The system ensures loyalty through economic dependency, while providing spiritual justification for conditions that would otherwise inspire mutiny. When Red Corridor 19 appears on damage control schematics marked as expendable volume, those 32 souls receive no briefing, only extra rations and sermons on trust. Administrative waivers trade ink for risk through processes that transform dangerous decisions into defensible documentation. The Pilgrim's departure authorization bears 17 stamps and seals, each representing an office that reviewed and approved her operational status despite known deficiencies. Every signature shifts accountability upward until responsibility dissolves into collective decision-making that protects individuals while endangering everyone. Austerity acquires moral gloss through ecclesiarchy doctrine that transforms scarcity into virtue. Confessor Matthias Vex Corvain delivers homilies praising the crew's willingness to accept hardship in service of the Emperor's will, reframing dangerous conditions as opportunities for spiritual growth. His reports blend spiritual assessment with operational readiness evaluation, identifying personnel whose faith might waver under continued stress, while maintaining lists of those requiring transfer or more direct intervention. The arithmetic of empire emerges through accumulated compromises that appear reasonable within immediate contexts. Delay departure and soldiers starve, refuse contraband components, and systems fail. Maintain full safety margins, and the war effort collapses. Each decision compounds into systematic vulnerability, creating conditions where catastrophic failure becomes not merely possible, but inevitable. This is how a Gellar field begins to thin, not through sudden rupture, but through slow degradation, masked by bureaucratic sleight of hand and desperate improvisation. The contraband stabilizer promises efficiency through elimination of harmonic variations that indicate healthy system function, delivering smoothness that may be silence wearing makeup. Silence in the warp is not necessarily safety. It may indicate successful camouflage or complete exposure to predators who no longer hunt, because prey has announced its location. The pilgrim departs within this arithmetic, 7 clusters declaring harmony, while one does so with help it should not need. With invariance, travels with cargo manifests toward a war that operates its own economy of risk, consuming whatever reaches it without questioning how it arrived. Material tells truth that paperwork conceals. Thermal maps show feathering heat across projector casings. Harmonics drift inside tolerances, but with persistence that makes experienced tech priests itch. Condensation appears on joints that have always stayed dry. The contraband stabilizer will promise efficiency. At what cost does it deliver this deceptive smoothness? Austerity has moral gloss that transforms dangerous conditions into spiritual opportunities. But who pays when that gloss peels away, revealing the raw compromises beneath? The ledger accounts for acceptable losses. The warp keeps different books entirely. A Gellar field does not fail like a bulkhead buckling or a plasma conduit rupturing. It dissolves. The breakdown follows a pathology as predictable as disease, each stage bleeding into the next, with symptoms that experienced crew learn to recognize through instincts refined over generations of desperate maintenance. The Adeptus Mechanicus has catalogued this progression in archives sealed behind 17 different classifications, because knowledge of failure can become invitation to failure when spoken carelessly in the void. Stage 1 manifests as harmonic deviation, barely perceptible to augmetic sensors, but immediately obvious to human ears attuned to the field's rhythm. The characteristic 23.7 Hz resonance shifts down by half a tone, creating subsonic discord that makes crew members unconsciously adjust their breathing patterns. Junior Enginseer Heth feels it first through his Rosarius. Prayer beads that normally rest cool against his chest begin warming as their blessed metal reacts to electromagnetic variance. Hair rises on arms and necks as static electricity builds on metal surfaces, creating tiny arcs that dance between fingers and handrails. The ozone scent changes from sharp cleanliness to cloying sweetness, indicating molecular breakdown as atmospheric processes struggle with changes they were never designed to handle. Chronometers drift by seconds that accumulate into minutes, creating temporal inconsistencies that manifest as shift changes occurring at different times in different sections. Tech Priest Magos Dacriel Omicron's servo skulls begin reporting contradictory data. The same corridor measured as both regulation width and something impossible simultaneously. Countermeasures remain routine at this stage. Harmonic recalibration through prescribed quarter turns of phase wheels, incense saturation to increase particulate density, generator load balancing across the septuple array. Success rate approaches 90% if intervention occurs within the first hour. Delay transforms maintenance into emergency procedure. Stage 2 introduces bleed-through effects as reality begins thinning at edges. Condensation beads on surfaces that should remain dry. Bulkheads, control panels, the inside of helmet visors, as moisture from elsewhere seeps through microscopic gaps in space-time. Auditory bleed begins as whispers in languages that sound familiar but use words in wrong combinations. Crew members hear their names called from empty corridors, conversations echoing from sealed compartments, laughter that stops when they turn toward its source. The ship's Vox system carries voices that match no crew manifest, speaking in dialects that shift between High Gothic and something older. Temperature inversions create pockets of impossible climate. Arctic cold adjacent to tropical heat, neither condition explainable by atmospheric systems functioning normally elsewhere. Metal surfaces become too hot or too cold to touch without warning, their thermal properties responding to rules that physics textbooks do not contain. Emergency protocols escalate. Buddy chains ensure no one walks alone through affected sections. Ward prayers recited continuously by rotating shifts provide psychic anchors. Emergency incense protocols flood compromised areas with particulate clouds thick enough to obscure vision while creating electromagnetic barriers that slow intrusion effects. Stage 3 brings physical manifestation as the ship's structure begins responding to influences that should not exist. Lights strobe in patterns that hurt to watch directly, their illumination revealing shadows that move independently of their casting objects. Bulkhead icons weep resin, blessed seals and purity marks exuding substances that smell of copper and fear, their sacred geometry distorting as if viewed through water. Shadows thicken beyond what available light sources should produce, pooling in corners and flowing along deck plates like liquid darkness. These shadows sometimes move against the direction of illumination changes, occasionally revealing glimpses of spaces that do not exist within the ship's known architecture. Corridors that extend farther than hull dimensions allow, chambers whose geometry hurts to contemplate. Confessor Matthias Vex Corvern leads consecration teams through compromised sections, carrying blessed flamers and portable shrine altars, their prayers reinforced by industrial-strength incense applied directly to affected surfaces. Sector isolation seals affected areas behind blast doors, while atmospheric systems work overtime to prevent contamination spread. Stage 4 escalates to cognitive intrusion as auditory bleed evolves from whispers into conversations using crew members' names and personal details that should be private, spoken in voices that sound like deceased relatives or childhood friends. The conversations reference events that have not yet occurred, discuss people who died years ago as if they remain alive, describe the ship's layout using room names that appear on no official plans. Mass hallucination differentials emerge as the most dangerous symptom. Crew members in identical locations report seeing completely different environments. One person sees normal corridor. Another sees the same space flooded with knee-deep water. A third perceives walls covered in writing that shifts between languages. These are not individual delusions, but reality becoming subjective. Different versions of the same space existing simultaneously. Temperature patterns invert without apparent cause, creating microclimates that exist independently of environmental management systems. The contraband stabilizer installed in the septuple array begins producing readings so smooth they suggest deception rather than stability, harmonics flattened into artificial consistency that masks rather than measures actual field integrity. Stage 5 represents complete breakdown of the reality barrier. The field no longer merely thins, it ruptures. People do not see the same corridor because corridors have become multiple spaces occupying identical coordinates. Navigation becomes impossible as passages lead to destinations that change based on who travels them. Maps become useless. Memory becomes unreliable. The ship's architecture responds to expectation rather than engineering. Emergency protocols abandon subtlety. Atmospheric venting creates vacuum barriers. Emergency jettison sacrifices affected sections. Scuttle charges serve as final option when containment becomes impossible. These measures save the many by sacrificing the few, arithmetic that Imperial doctrine treats as mathematics rather than murder. Red Corridor 19 exemplifies this calculus. The section appears on damage control schematics, with notation translating as expendable volume. 32 souls whose lives are entered in ledgers rather than laments, their quarters marked for potential jettison if containment fails. The inhabitants know only their official designation as passenger accommodation. They remain unaware that their corridor appears on 3 different plans, with 3 different purposes. Crew protocols reflect institutional preparation for systematic failure. Chalk marks on bulkheads help navigation when corridors become unreliable. Salt lines at thresholds serve both superstition and practical function, drying condensate that might bridge electrical contacts. Locking navigators deeper in their sanctums prevents their third eye from seeing things that might drive them mad. Incense saturation so thick that breathing becomes difficult, but electromagnetic interference drops to manageable levels. The progression from Stage 1 to Stage 5 typically occurs over hours, providing time for countermeasures if crew respond immediately to early symptoms. Delay at any stage accelerates progression to the next, creating cascading failure that becomes increasingly difficult to contain. The pathology teaches harsh lessons. In the void between stars, vigilance is the only virtue that matters, and preparation for failure is the only honest policy. The hum drops a fraction and keeps falling. In the Pilgrim of Sorrow's Gellar Sanctum, Tech Adept Vex 77 feels the deviation through his Rosarius before any instrument registers change, blessed metal warming against his chest as electromagnetic variance bleeds through the ship's superstructure like infection through a wound. The characteristic 23.7 Hz resonance that has served as the ship's heartbeat for 17 months slides down to 22.1, creating subsonic discord that makes sleeping crew members unconsciously adjust their breathing patterns in distant habdecks. But the Auspex readings stay green. The contraband harmonic stabilizer, installed through channels that officially do not exist, performs its deception with mathematical precision. Where honest Imperial technology would register dangerous fluctuations as warning signals, the stabilizer smooths harmonics into artificial consistency, feeding false data to monitoring systems, while reality thins around the ship like ice under spring sun. Smooth is wrong. Experienced crew learn to distrust readings that suggest perfection, because perfection in the 41st millennium is either miracle or fraud, and miracles are rationed more carefully than blessed oils. Minute 0 to 1, the silent scream. In the Enginarium Cathedral, the septuple resonance array begins its slow desynchronization. Sacred geometry warps as generator clusters fall out of phase by fractions of degrees. Cluster tertia lags behind prescribed timing. Quarter overcorrects with mechanical eagerness. Septima refuses to answer diagnostic queries. The mathematical relationships that create protective interference patterns start collapsing, but the process occurs gradually enough that automated systems interpret it as normal drift requiring routine adjustment. Magos Dacriel Omicron feels the failure first as absence, a shape where a tone should sit in the cathedral's acoustic environment. His servo skulls fan outward with increasing agitation, their blessed circuitry detecting contradictions their programming cannot reconcile. One skull reports optimal field integrity. Another measures electromagnetic signatures consistent with imminent failure. A third registers both readings simultaneously from identical sensors. "Deception in the numbers," he hisses through his Vox grill, which is as close as the Mechanicus comes to admitting fear. In the Navigator's sanctum, Lady Navigator Corvaxa sits throne-bound within her sphere of blessed adamantine, third eye sealed behind silk wrappings that suddenly feel too tight against her skull. Her Chorines, psychically sensitive servants who assist with warp navigation, begin biting their tongues in unison, blood trickling from their lips as their synchronized distress creates ripples in the ship's psychic atmosphere. Corvaxa's veins script themselves with star language that burns silver beneath pale skin. Ancient bloodline, mutations responding to stimuli that should not exist within Gellar field protection. Red Corridor 19 experiences the first physical manifestations. Chalk marks that maintenance crews use for navigation begin crawling along bulkheads like living things, their straight lines bending into curves that hurt to follow with the eye. The 32 souls sleeping in hammocks strung between cargo supports wake simultaneously, their dreams interrupted by whispers in languages they do not recognize but somehow understand. A child's wooden aquila, carved by loving hands on a distant world, begins humming lullabies in high Gothic, while its painted eyes weep resin that smells of copper and ancient fear. The Vox system carries 3 different reports of the same man's death. Seaman Vex Holt, crushed by falling debris, dissolved into constituent atoms, and simultaneously insisting he never existed, despite 20 witnesses who remember serving with him for 3 years. The ship's crew manifest updates itself in real time, adding and removing names as reality fluctuates around the vessel like tide around a drowning rock. Minute 1 to 2. Authority paralysis. The Gellar field does not tear like fabric. It scabs, developing rough patches where reality grows thin, then pocks like diseased skin as microscopic holes open between the ship and the immaterium. Through these gaps, shapes insinuate themselves, not quite geometry, not quite biology, suggestions of presence that exist more as possibility than actuality, probing the ship's interior with curious malevolence. On the bridge, Captain Mordian Vex watches his chronometer display 3 different times simultaneously, while tactical displays show corridors extending beyond the ship's known dimensions. His training screams emergency protocols, but Imperial doctrine demands precision over speed when souls hang in the balance. "Prepare tri-seal authorization," he commands, knowing that seconds matter, but procedure demands consensus from 3 authorities, whose responsibilities do not overlap cleanly. This is blood time, precious seconds bleeding away as doctrine wrestles with disaster. The cold start litany requires signatures from Captain, Magos, and Confessor, applied within breaths of each other, followed by 9-part recitation, whose cadence must not slip. Each voice anchors a piece of the pattern. Each role bears responsibility for consequences that may include damnation of everyone aboard. Confessor Matthias Vex Corven hesitates when called to provide his seal. His training emphasizes caution over speed, spiritual purity over tactical necessity. The cold start requires words spoken in exact sequence with perfect pronunciation. A single mispronounced syllable could damn the entire ship to worse fates than warp exposure. "Captain, The full rites require proper preparation. To rush them invites spiritual contamination. He clutches his aquila, with hands that shake not from age, but from the weight of choosing between doctrine and survival. Magos Dacriel Omicron demands full diagnostic sequence on all 7 generator clusters, his augmetic logic insisting on complete data before authorizing emergency procedures that might damage sacred machinery. Negative, Captain. The Omnisire demands empirical data before unproven ritual. His mechadendrites whir through subsystem checks, while reality dissolves around them. Loyalty divided between the ship and the machine god's protocols. Junior Rating Koran recites the litany of containment as he has been trained, but the words exit his mouth in wrong order, syllables rearranging themselves in the air between his lips and his listeners' ears. The litany becomes invitation rather than ward, its sacred phrases twisted into meanings that summon rather than banish. His face contorts in confusion as his tongue shapes sounds his mind did not intend. The machine spirit denied proper appeasement, responding with mechanical groans that harmonize with nothing holy. Minute 2 to 3. Violence as policy, bulkheads bow inward as if pressed by invisible hands, their adamantine construction groaning under stresses that physics cannot measure, but human ears can hear. The child's toy in Red Corridor 19 now speaks in perfect high Gothic, reciting names and service records of crew members who died decades ago on different ships, its wooden beak moving with mechanical precision, while carved eyes track movement that exists only in peripheral vision. Captain Vex abandons procedure for survival. The tri-seal process requires consensus, but consensus takes time, and time has become a weapon turned against them. He draws his bolt pistol, not to threaten his officers, but to demonstrate the violence he will apply to save the ship. The arithmetic of empire reduces to simple mathematics. Sacrifice few to preserve many. Trade known lives for possible salvation. Jettison Red Corridor 19. The words assemble in his mouth with visible labor, each syllable weighted with consequence. The corridor appears on damage control schematics as expendable volume. 32 souls whose lives are entered in ledgers rather than laments, their quarters marked for potential sacrifice if containment fails. 32 souls become numbers in the span between heartbeats. The captain's resolve cuts through institutional paralysis like a blade through silk. Confessor Vex Corvain sees the necessity and provides his seal without further hesitation. Magos Dacriel Omicron abandons diagnostic protocols, his augmetic logic accepting that perfect information matters less than immediate action when the alternative is total loss. The tri-seal completes with 3 keys turned, 3 signatures applied, 3 voices braided into the cold start litany's 9 parts. The confessor leads with words that announce repentance, the magos with words that teach machines to forget, the captain with words that accept consequence. Tech adepts crack open the array and throw levers that have not moved in years, because they were never meant to move, their hands guided by desperation rather than doctrine. Red Corridor 19 vents to space, with a sound like the universe screaming. The jettison charges snap in polite sequence, bulkheads coughing, blinking, consenting to murder disguised as mathematics. The section leaves the pilgrim like a bead of water shaking loose from a blade, for one crystalline second remaining visible, a little house with little lives, then turning to a line, then to nothing. The breath it takes from the ship is measurable, Pressure dips, then recovers. The breath it takes from 32 sets of lungs is recorded as adjustment to cargo mass. The cold start litany tears the Gellar field down to component frequencies, then claws it back into existence through brute application of power levels that may destroy the generators providing it. Reactors surge beyond safe parameters. The field lurches raggedly back over the hull like a sail in a storm, its harmonics rough and uneven, but functional. The contraband stabilizer burns out in a shower of sparks and blessed oils, its deception finally revealed as authentic Imperial generators resume their honest, slightly ragged song. But the warp leaves fingerprints. A stain appears in a conduit on Deck 9 that manifests under certain angles of light and certain ranks of sorrow. Liquid shadow that moves when no one watches and refuses to be present when inspected. A name vanishes from all crew manifests, leaving gaps in prayer rotations that no one can explain, but everyone feels. Sister Vex Corina wakes on Deck 4 and weeps without reportable cause, mourning someone who officially never existed, but whose absence tears holes in her memory like shrapnel through silk. The Pilgrim of Sorrow breathes with the rhythm of survivors rather than the confident pulse of the untested. Emergency lighting casts harsh shadows that seem deeper than they should be. The air tastes of ozone and copper and something else. Something that might be fear made manifest, or might be the lingering scent of places that exist between spaces. The hum returns ragged, and therefore true, honest in its imperfection, trustworthy in its admission of damage sustained and prices paid. Survival is not safety. Rescue is not arrival. The cold start has saved the hull and extended the ship's life, but only to write a cleaner epitaph. The episode pivots on this truth. The Imperium's salvation protocols are designed not to preserve, but to contain, not to rescue, but to ensure that failure remains localized, manageable, accountable in ledgers that balance lives against logistics with mathematical precision. The Pilgrim of Sorrow breathes like a wounded animal in the aftermath of the cold start. Harsh, irregular, alive through stubbornness rather than health. The Gellar field flickers with the rough honesty that experienced crew learn to trust over deceptive smoothness. Its harmonics, ragged where the contraband stabilizer once masked dangerous fluctuations beneath artificial perfection. Containment becomes sacrament in these hours, each countermeasure blessed and applied with the desperate precision of field surgery performed on a starship's soul. Systematic isolation begins with bulkheads sealed, according to doctrine written in the blood of previous disasters. Hatch's dog manual rather than automatic because automated systems lie when reality has recently been negotiable. Tech Adept Vex 77 leads damage assessment teams through compromised sections, their movements guided by chalk marks applied to walls that proved willing to improvise their geometry during the breach. Auspex sweeps proceed in pairs. One operator reads instruments, while another listens to the hum with teeth and tongue, because flesh still detects what glass sometimes refuses to admit when warp residue clings to sensor arrays like oil on water. The contraband stabilizer's autopsy reveals layers of deception sophisticated enough to fool Imperial inspection protocols. Vex 77's augmetic fingers sort through components that reek of heretic modification. Their housings bearing forged purity seals, whose wax contains no blessed tallow, whose vellum carries prayers written in synthetic ink that fluoresces under Auspex examination. The device's core circuitry shows STC pattern alterations, standard designs modified through techniques that prioritize efficiency over spiritual compliance, creating technology that functions without proper machine spirit appeasement. Provenance emerges through residue rather than confession. Serial numbers ground away leave tool chatter. Power signatures logged in the array's memory show initialization handshakes not found in approved schematics. Maintenance subroutine names resolve to shipping codes used by Factorum Tertius Omega, a manufacturing facility that exists in administratum records but appears on no official Navy supplier list. Cross-referencing through ecclesiarchy shipping manifests reveals the Factorum operates under clerical cover, distributing contraband components through monastery supply chains that treat harmonic stabilizers as sacred resonance chambers for liturgical enhancement. The sigil stamped into the stabilizer's lacquer, a stylized crozier over a cog, serves dual purpose as authentication mark and shipping sode. The paint carries wrong gloss, synthetic compounds that approximate sacred formulations while lacking actual sanctification. Magos Dacriel Omicron performs ritual dismantling with ceremonial precision, each component removed according to prescribed sequence, while servo skulls document evidence for transmission to Mechanicus authorities. The stabilizer's machine spirit proves artificial construction rather than authentic awakening, a simulacrum of consciousness created through forbidden techniques that mimic proper consecration while serving different masters. Confessor Matthias Vex Corvain leads purification teams through affected sections with the methodical thoroughness of exterminators purging vermin. His portable shrine altar burns with blessed flamers, whose sacred promethium carries additives that serve both spiritual and practical functions. Flames consume organic contamination, while their specific chemical composition helps neutralize electromagnetic residue left by warp exposure. Industrial-strength incense applied directly to affected surfaces creates particulate clouds so dense they obscure vision, while providing electromagnetic barriers that slow intrusion effects. The incense is no metaphor. Resin particulates suspended in atmospheric processors actually dampen electrostatic interference in coils still recovering from emergency restart procedures. What appears as religious theater serves dual function as technical mitigation, ancient ecclesiarchy knowledge encoding practical solutions within ritual observance. Blend 7 incense contains metallic compounds that create conductive pathways for stray electromagnetic energy. Sacred oils applied to generator housings provide thermal regulation, while their chemical composition helps stabilize harmonic resonance in systems traumatized by forced restart. The half-seen stain manifesting in Deck 9, Conduits, becomes focus of systematic hunting expedition. Auspex teams track movement patterns, while prayer squads attempt containment using blessed barriers and concentrated incense. The stain responds to attention by becoming less visible, suggesting intelligence or survival instinct that makes direct confrontation impossible. Teams drive it through maintenance passages using lamentations in monotone and portable flamer threats until cornering it in a conduit where superheated promethium, blessed by ecclesiarchy flamekeepers, can flash purge whatever remains of the intrusion. Corpse processing follows protocols designed to prevent posthumous contamination. Bodies of crew members who died during field failure receive hexagrammic foil wrapping that prevents spiritual residue from using remains as anchor points, The dead sometimes serve as conduits for influences that refuse to acknowledge mortality as limitation. Each corpse receives blessed silver tags that tarnish if exposed to warp residue, creating early warning system for corruption that might spread to living personnel handling remains. Survivors undergo systematic examination designed to identify and contain potential contamination before it spreads. Medici check for physical changes, unusual markings, temperature variations, reflexes responding to stimuli that should not exist. Catechisms and salt serve dual function as spiritual cleansing and diagnostic tool. Corrupted individuals often struggle with specific prayers or show adverse reactions to blessed substances applied to skin. Those displaying distress or deviation from approved responses receive marking for further processing. Euphemistic language covering everything from penance labor to servitorization. Administrative sanitization transforms catastrophe into bureaucratic routine through careful language protecting institutional authority while acknowledging necessary sacrifice. Captain Mordian Vex signs forms with hands that remember the weight of bolt pistol used to enforce his will during crisis. The jettisoned souls from Red Corridor 19 appear in ledgers as cargo mass adjustment due to structural compromise. 32 lives rounded down to 30 for cleaner mathematics, their deaths recorded as equipment loss rather than personnel casualty. This represents policy rather than callousness. Accurate documentation would create liability chains, compromising future operational decisions. Each signature appears on 17 different documents: casualty reports, equipment loss assessments, disciplinary actions against personnel who questioned orders, commendations for those who executed them without hesitation. Paperwork creates legal protection for decisions made in seconds, transforming desperate choices into defensible policy through careful word selection and proper formatting. The distress ping transmitted during crisis carries implications extending beyond immediate survival. The coded phrase, "containment compromised, protocol Omega-7 initiated," appears in classified manuals as signal indicating vessel suffered warp exposure severe enough to require external intervention. This specific combination triggers protocols prioritizing containment over rescue, quarantine over salvation. The phrase travels through astropathic relay stations using priority channels reserved for threats to Imperial security. Reception triggers automatic responses. Patrol groups receive diversion orders. Inquisition assets activate monitoring protocols. Sector Command begins calculating acceptable loss ratios. The Pilgrim's request for help becomes notification of potential threat requiring management through established procedures, treating infected vessels as hazards to be contained rather than assets preserved. The Navy hears that phrase differently. Where the captain sought rescue, they receive contamination report. Where he requested assistance, they hear threat assessment requiring decisive action against potential plague carrier. Tech Adept Vex 77 completes his shift in the Gellar sanctum with movements acquiring new precision, born from recent terror. He marks purity seals with extra care, counts clicks with additional attention, listens to the hum with ears understanding how quickly honest roughness becomes deceptive smoothness. The contraband stabilizer's removal restored authentic Imperial functionality. Imperfect, reliable, trustworthy in its admission of limitations rather than promising impossible perfection. The candle burns in its safety cage with flame that flickers rather than holding steady. Its honest uncertainty, preferable to artificial stability. Wax drips at natural rate, creating patterns, speaking of genuine process rather than manufactured result. The sanctum fills with smoke carrying prayers and particulates in equal measure, both serving designated functions in endless work of keeping reality intact, around 47,000 souls, minus 32. On the bridge, quiet settles heavy with unspoken implications. The hum holds with ragged honesty. Emergency lighting creates harsh shadows that remain where shadows belong rather than moving independently. The ship's architecture responds to engineering rather than expectation. Passages leading to destinations that stay constant, regardless of who travels them. Each choice bears signatures in soot and ink, decisions made in blood time, now transformed into defensible documentation. The coded phrase triggers doctrine older than the captain's authority. Protocols assuming contamination spreads faster than information, treating prevention as preferable to cure. The contraband stabilizer has provenance tracing to networks operating under ecclesiarchy protection, rogue factorums whose heretic modifications serve markets that officially do not exist. Who profits from corrosion when sacred supply chains carry contamination disguised as salvation, when the machinery of faith becomes machinery of fraud, wearing pious masks over commercial ambition. What approaches the pilgrim may not be rescue, but something colder, something measuring 47,000 souls against billions who might suffer if contamination escapes containment. The arithmetic of empire operates through calculations, pricing individual lives against collective survival. And those calculations have already begun their inexorable progress toward conclusions the crew will not be consulted about. The coded phrase travels through astropathic relay stations, like infection through a bloodstream, each transmission node adding authentication seals and routing stamps that transform desperate plea into threat assessment. Containment compromised, Protocol Omega-7 initiated, appears in classified manuals, not as emergency code, but as confession of contamination, admission that warp exposure has occurred at levels requiring external intervention. The phrase moves through psychic networks, using priority channels reserved for threats to Imperial security, triggering automatic responses throughout sector command structure, with the cold efficiency of immune systems detecting disease. Admiral Corvaxer Vex Tertius receives the transmission aboard the battlecruiser Inexorable Judgment while conducting patrol operations 3 systems distant. Her command staff reviews the coded message, with expressions shifting from concern to grim calculation as implications crystallize. The Pilgrim of Sorrow requests assistance. Naval doctrine interprets this as notification of potential plague vector requiring containment. Where civilians perceive rescue operation, the Navy recognizes quarantine enforcement demanding immediate implementation. Battlefleet doctrine proves explicit where public liturgy remains deliberately vague. In-transit warp compromise equals quarantine, and if quarantine cannot be guaranteed, scuttle. The edict carries numerical designation, witness seals, and archival classification under locks that outlive admirals. Purity of space precedes purity of soul. The Imperium would rather explain a vanished ship than confront demon manifestation on populated world. The mathematics prove brutally simple. Better 1,000 lost in the dark than 1 billion in broad daylight. Squadron Tertius diverts from planned patrol route using navigation data, treating the Pilgrim as hazard rather than vessel in distress. Astrogation plots intercept vectors designed to prevent the mass conveyor from translating near inhabited systems, forcing emergence in empty space where contamination can be contained through conventional firepower. The squadron's approach uses formation patterns optimized for threat neutralization rather than rescue operations, lance batteries charging with methodical preparation of executioners rather than saviors. Inquisition seals amplify this logic through doctrine treating secrecy as more valuable than individual lives. Inquisitor Matthias Corvin maintains permanent liaison aboard the inexorable Judgment, his authority superseding naval command when warp-related threats require specialized response. His files contain casualty projections, calculating acceptable loss ratios with mathematical precision. One contaminated ship represents manageable damage. One contaminated system becomes sector-wide catastrophe. One contaminated sector threatens entire segmentum stability. The Admiral's response follows protocols established through millennia of bitter experience with warp contamination. Her orders position Squadron Tertius not to provide assistance, but to ensure the Pilgrim does not exit the warp near populated gravity wells. The coded transmission triggers automatic responses. Patrol groups receive diversion orders, creating quarantine corridor enforced through strategic absence. Sector Command begins calculating acceptable loss ratios. Inquisition assets activate monitoring protocols, scanning for signs of taint, spreading through communication networks. Captain Mordian Vex receives response to his distress call through channels carrying implications rather than explicit orders. The transmission identifies itself as assistance coordination, while providing instructions that experienced officers recognize as preparation for scuttle procedures. Hold translation at designated coordinates. Prepare for voiding protocols. Maintain communication discipline. Each phrase carries double meaning. Hold position means prevent escape. Prepare for voiding means ready the ship for destruction. Maintain communication. Discipline means accept orders without question. The captain reads between lines with understanding, born from decades of imperial service, tasting copper in recycled air and old ink on new authority. His bridge crew lean forward unconsciously, as if they might catch sympathy hidden between syllables. None exists. His request for rescue has been interpreted as threat requiring management. The assistance approaching carries authorization to destroy rather than save if contamination cannot be contained through acceptable means. Here the primary twist reveals itself. The Imperium's rescue protocol is Erasure Protocol, written in bureaucratic language that masks lethal intent. The Shield civilization praises becomes rationed technology, backed by policy, assuming failure and demanding silence when that failure threatens to spread beyond acceptable parameters. The cold start litany that saved the Pilgrim from immediate destruction has merely extended her life long enough for proper disposal, according to established protocols, buying time to write cleaner epitaph rather than achieving genuine salvation. This recontextualizes the entire set-piece from Chapter 7. The captain's agonizing decision to jettison Red Corridor 19, the Magos' reluctant compliance, the Confessor's grim sanction. These acts of brutal pragmatism were not about saving the Pilgrim for triumphant return, but about managing inevitable demise. The 3 minutes of forever become final, desperate act of self-purification, before Navy quarantine cleanses the ship utterly, ensuring records show vessel that fought bravely to contain contamination, rather than one succumbing quickly to warp embrace. Squadron Tertius approaches with weapons charged and shields raised, treating the Pilgrim as target rather than victim. Admiral Vex Tertius reviews final authorization codes, transforming rescue mission into execution if contamination cannot be verified as contained. The silence proves more terrifying than threats. No hails, no assistance offers, only cold, unblinking gaze of distant Auspex beams. The crew feels weight of that silence, unspoken judgment they recognize from whispered rumors of ships that simply vanished after warp incursions. Naval doctrine treats every warp-compromised vessel as potential plague ship, regardless of apparent recovery. Logic proves sound through historical precedent. Ships surviving field failures often carried subtle contamination, manifesting weeks or months later, spreading through crew interactions, supply transfers, communication networks. Prevention requires treating survival itself as suspicious circumstance rather than fortunate outcome. The very act of enduring what should kill becomes evidence of potential corruption. The doctrine's cruel arithmetic emerges through accumulated institutional wisdom. Each ship responding to distress calls becomes potential vector for whatever infected original vessel. Quarantine protocols prioritize containment over rescue, because rescue operations risk spreading contamination to clean vessels, clean crews, clean systems. The arithmetic of empire demands sacrifice of few to preserve many, treating compassion as luxury the Imperium cannot afford when survival hangs in balance. Captain Vex faces this arithmetic in purest form. His successful containment of warp breach preserves ship and crew, but survival itself has marked them as potential threats requiring external validation. The protocols designed to protect Imperial citizens now classify those citizens as hazards when they survive what should have killed them. The shield becomes cage when those it protects are deemed too dangerous for integration with clean population. Confessor Vex Corvain leads prayer services acknowledging this reality without explicitly stating it, his homilies praising crew faith while preparing them for whatever judgment approaches. Tech Adept Vex 77 maintains Gellar Field with particular attention to readings, providing evidence of clean status. Understanding external authorities may interpret identical data as sophisticated concealment rather than genuine recovery. The Pilgrim of Sorrow holds position in empty space, crew maintaining hope, while understanding hope itself may be interpreted as evidence of corruption by entities that should not permit optimism among those exposed to warp influence. The hum continues honest and rough, but honesty may prove insufficient when policy demands proof of purity no test can definitively provide. If the state chooses fire, why do crews still sail? What keeps them compliant when survival becomes suspicious? When rescue protocols become erasure protocols wearing masks of mercy? What happens to those who evade the Navy's arithmetic and live when official policy assumes their death serves greater good? The answers lie not in hope, but in grim necessities of duty and pervasive power of belief in system offering only survival, never salvation. The boarding lights blink on in boat bays. The ship exhales. Somewhere, candle in sanctum gutters and steadies. The hum holds, for now. Survival aboard an Imperial vessel is not a conclusion, but an administrative category, demanding further processing. The Pilgrim of Sorrow's crew discover this truth through boarding parties that arrive not as rescuers, but as auditors. Their hazmat seals and auspex scanners, calibrated to detect contamination that may not manifest for months or years. Those who lived through warp breach become evidence rather than heroes, their continued existence requiring explanation to authorities who understand that exposure to the immaterium leaves marks invisible to conventional examination. The processing begins with systematic segregation. Boarding parties from Squadron Tertius establish quarantine protocols, treating the entire crew as potentially compromised until proven otherwise. Personnel receive classification tags color-coded according to exposure levels. Green for minimal contact with affected areas, amber for proximity to breach zones, red for direct exposure to warp manifestation. The 32 souls who occupied Red Corridor 19 receive posthumous classification as black, total exposure presumed, their jettisoning recorded as containment success rather than tragic necessity. Medici examination proves more invasive than standard Imperial health assessment, conducted by specialists in environmental suits while crew members stand naked under lights revealing more than flesh. Teams trained in recognizing warp taint search for temperature variations indicating metabolic changes, reflexes responding to stimuli that should not exist, cellular mutations detectable only through blessed silver instruments that tarnish when exposed to corruption. Blood samples receive analysis through techniques blending medical science with theological interpretation. Chemical composition matters less than spiritual purity, measured through reactions to blessed substances applied directly to skin. Sanctioned psychers audit memories with surgical precision, their minds trained to detect psychic residue clinging to thoughts like oil on water. The process proves traumatic for subjects who feel alien presence sifting through private moments, extracting recollections for analysis while leaving gaps where dangerous memories once resided. They probe for cognitive dissonance, inconsistencies in memory, any lingering suggestion of the warp's touch that might manifest as nightmares attracting unwanted attention from entities dwelling between spaces. The outcomes follow institutional logic rather than individual merit. Penance labor awaits those showing minor contamination signs, assignment to shielded shrines, where potentially compromised souls serve the Emperor while remaining isolated from clean population. Servitorization becomes fate for those too touched by warp exposure, their consciousness partially erased and replaced with mechanical programming that eliminates contamination risk while preserving useful skills. The blessing of forgetting represents lobotomy disguised as mercy, surgical removal of memories containing dangerous knowledge, performed with blessed instruments, while ecclesiarchy choirs sing hymns drowning out screams. Rare exemption exists for essential specialists whose skills outweigh contamination risks, but such mercy comes with oaths and collars, binding agreements enforced through explosive devices implanted in neck vertebrae, ensuring compliance while providing immediate termination option if corruption manifests. Junior Rating Corran exemplifies the system's cruel precision. Reassigned from Red Corridor 19 30 minutes before jettisoning due to shift rotation, he survived through administrative accident rather than divine favor. Now he coughs, blessed incense and guilt in equal measure. his lungs struggling with particulate saturation prescribed as spiritual cleansing. The administrative response proves characteristically efficient. His corridor never existed according to revised ship manifests. His grief becomes error requiring correction through therapeutic intervention. Records show Red Corridor 19 as storage bay jettisoned to prevent structural compromise, containing no personnel. His memories conflict with official documentation, creating cognitive dissonance treated as contamination symptom rather than accurate recollection. Tech acolyte Vex 77 faces different challenges. Her report identifying the contraband harmonic stabilizer conflicts, with institutional preference for external blame rather than internal failure. Her technical expertise makes her valuable, but her knowledge of systemic vulnerabilities makes her dangerous to authorities preferring simple explanations. Her file receives classification seals, preventing distribution, while she receives secondment to Inquisitorial Forge Temple, where her skills serve specialized projects requiring absolute discretion. The secondment represents promotion by muzzle, advancement accompanied by isolation from normal Imperial society. Her dangerous expertise contained within institutions equipped to manage such knowledge safely. Administrative sanitization transforms catastrophe into bureaucratic routine through careful language protecting institutional authority. Records follow policy rather than grief. 32 becomes 30 in ledgers, so columns align, column alignment proving someone still believes in order. Each signature appears on 17 different documents, creating legal protection for decisions made in seconds, transforming desperate choices into defensible policy through proper formatting and word selection that shifts accountability upward until responsibility dissolves into collective decision-making. This answers the early question. Survivors are rarely heroes in Imperial doctrine. They are liabilities requiring management through systems prioritizing collective safety over individual recognition. Their continued existence proves problematic because survival itself becomes evidence of potential corruption when exposure should have resulted in death or madness. The Imperium treats those who live through warp breach as statistical anomalies requiring explanation and, ultimately, containment through channels that transform heroism into hazard requiring institutional response. The processing reveals institutional philosophy. Better to sacrifice clean souls than risk contaminated ones spreading taint through normal social interaction. Each survivor undergoes evaluation measuring usefulness against potential threat, with outcomes ranging from honored service in isolated positions to complete erasure through servitorization or therapeutic forgetting. The system preserves valuable skills while eliminating dangerous knowledge, ensuring Imperial efficiency continues while contamination risks receive appropriate management. Crew folklore begins filling gaps where official policy creates silence. Stories spread through whispered conversations in mess halls and maintenance spaces, creating alternative narratives explaining what happened when reality became negotiable. These rumors serve dual function, providing psychological comfort through shared understanding, while creating dangerous knowledge that attracts attention from entities feeding on collective belief and fear. In the aftermath of crisis, when official channels provide silence and sealed files, folklore blooms like fungus in ship's corners, thriving on ignorance, feeding on fear, occasionally offering wisdom that policy cannot provide. Aboard imperial vessels, rumors serve functions that regulations cannot fill. They preserve practical knowledge when official channels fail, create psychological comfort where doctrine offers only duty, and sometimes encode survival techniques that work despite contradicting approved procedures. The songs prove most revealing. Void-born grandmothers teach cradle rhythms to children sleeping near reactor bulkheads. 3 slow beats, 1 quick, 1 held. Sung softly, the pattern matches the 23.7 Hz resonance of healthy Gellar fields. Centuries ago, a tech priest timed startup cycles to that rhythm, then died. The melody survived the man. Aboard the Pilgrim, riggers hum it while securing cargo, believing it wards unwanted attention. It accomplishes something more practical. It teaches lungs and hands to notice harmonic drift, when notes pull long or short without intention. Even untrained voices feel changes before Auspex clerks file exception reports. Ritual becomes metronome. Metronome becomes early warning. Chalk arrows proliferate throughout compromised sections, pointing toward safe rooms, true doors, and the short way to air. Petty Officer Rain, 30 years under hulls, forbids curved marks. Only cowards bend. He understands that bent lines creep more easily during the next thin time. Straight chalk travels less in the eye, less in the mind, resisting the ship's brief desire to be elsewhere. This represents fieldcraft disguised as folk art, geometry as survival tool rather than superstition. Salt lines at thresholds serve similar dual purpose. The ecclesiarchy blesses salt for purification. Deck bosses insist on it because salt dries condensate that creeps along seams and bridges electrical contacts. Salted hatches squeal rather than slur when pressure changes. During Stage 2 manifestations, when moisture beads where it shouldn't, white scum appears first along diligent thresholds. Those who scrub it away and redust their lines report fewer shorted panels, while others request miracles and additional candles. Black market saints' medals adapt to meet dual needs. St. Gaius Null medallions, copper slugs sleeved in tin, looped on wire, sell through lay brothers citing miracles while serving practical function. Suspended from bulkheads with hair strands, the medals quiver when harmonics thicken and stay still when readings prove honest. They function as poor man's seismographs, worn as piety, to dodge commissariat bans on unauthorized indicators. Copper conducts truth, tin preserves it, wire transmits both to human nervous systems, calibrated through generations of void exposure. The ecclesiarchy tolerates useful superstition while suppressing destabilizing prophecy, through policies treating folklore as pressure valve rather than threat. Confessor Matthias Vex Corvain permits harmless rituals, improving operational efficiency, while identifying and eliminating beliefs that might undermine command authority or invite warp attention. His reports distinguish between constructive tradition and destructive speculation, allowing practices serving ship function while containing those spreading panic or heretical thought. Myths about quiet decks prove partially accurate through accidental engineering. Deck 12B earns reputation for safety because it sits between coolant spines and wasted cargo bay, areas where field geometry runs strong, hum transmits clean, lights tick less. People sleep better there. The Master-at-Arms schedules exhausted crews through 12B deliberately, logging rotation as structural inspection. Belief sleeps, sleep repairs, repairs hold. The Mechanicus demonstrates less flexibility, but equal pragmatism. Magos Dacriel Omicron despises unlogged practices, yet quietly absorbs what works. The grandmother rhythm appears in footnotes as recommended cadence for low-level fan balancing. Chalk geometry rules enter maintenance circulars as consistency requirements for emergency marking. When pressed, the Magos insists these were always canon. Doctrine expands by pretending it never moved. Dangerous folklore receives systematic suppression through commissariat intervention. Commissar Vex Thane tears down posters advertising Quiet Deck 12B when crowds gather. He confiscates demon cards used by bored voidsmen for fortune-telling. Small rectangles printed with hexes and grinning skulls. His concern focuses not on cards themselves, but on attention they attract. Pattern divining becomes gateway vice in the void, too often graduating from drawing lots to listening for answers. Work customs preserve timing for procedures, whose precision exceeds human memory capacity. Nails hammered in crosses above Hab Bay hatches supposedly turn the gaze, but actually pull plates flush, reduce rattle, and dampen sympathetic vibration. During Stage 1 manifestations, when hum slides half tones, cross-hung hatches stay quiet while neighbors sing. Shape matters less than act. Mechanics understand that geometry smuggles practice past theology. Food adapts to scarcity through innovation disguised as tradition. Cooks thicken porridge with reclaimed wax, scraped from spent candle cages and filtered, justifying the practice as keeping blessing in the body. The wax binds certain particulates. Bodies excrete them. Placebo and filtration march together, whether or not the practice helps field stability. It helps people believe they possess agency rather than helplessness. Body customs proliferate among void-born populations. Hexagrammic line tattoos on forearms supposedly fool the eye that looks from outside. The Mechanicus sees superstition. The lines actually reduce sweat pooling, and arc burns at specific grip points on live panels. Carbon ink conducts, hands slip less, sparks bite less, men keep fingers. Faith saves flesh through accident rather than intervention. This creates the fundamental paradox. Rumor preserves morale, and, sometimes, equipment through transmission of practical knowledge disguised as cultural practice. Folk techniques work because they encode engineering principles discovered through trial and error over generations of desperate maintenance. Yet rumor also breeds fatalism and dangerous complacency, when superstition substitutes for proper procedure. When ritual replaces understanding, when comfort becomes more important than accuracy. The institutional response acknowledges folklore's utility while maintaining official disapproval. Navy regulations prohibit superstitious practices, while enforcement policies tacitly permit those proving operationally beneficial. Mechanicus doctrine condemns unauthorized ritual, while tech priests quietly incorporate useful folk techniques into approved procedures. Ecclesiarchy policy forbids unofficial religious practice, while confessors allow harmless traditions supporting crew spiritual health. This systematic hypocrisy serves institutional needs. Official disapproval provides legal protection when folk practices fail, while unofficial tolerance preserves useful knowledge that formal training cannot provide. The gap between policy and practice becomes feature rather than bug, allowing flexibility that rigid doctrine cannot accommodate while maintaining plausible deniability, when flexibility produces unwanted results. The price of endurance becomes ignorance by design. Crews learn enough to function without understanding principles behind their actions, preserving effectiveness while preventing dangerous curiosity. Folk knowledge fills gaps in official training, while remaining sufficiently vague to avoid challenging institutional authority or inviting heretical speculation about underlying mechanisms. Candles return to rationed status as issued items with dual-use applications, extending beyond illumination. Specific tallow composition creates particulate clouds when burned, providing electromagnetic interference control, while offering psychological comfort through familiar light. Supply officers distribute candles according to technical requirements, disguised as spiritual provisions, ensuring proper particulate density while maintaining morale through traditional methods. The Pilgrim of Sorrow's ordeal represents not aberration, but arithmetic, a single line item in ledgers so vast that individual tragedies appear as statistical noise in the margins. The Imperium's survival operates as an equation written in tonnage, ship days, purity seals, and signatures, where living bodies supply the difference when sums refuse to balance. Scale up from one ship's desperate 3 minutes to the Empire's daily calculations, and the invisible war of logistics emerges. A conflict fought with requisition forms and triage boards, where victory means acceptable loss rather than perfect safety. Port Sanctus, primary refit facility serving 17 systems, logs an average of 1,340 inbound hulls per standard month and clears 1,311. The deficit accumulates like interest on borrowed time. Each full Gellar overhaul consumes 26 ship days, 8 kilotons of approved alloys, 2 navigators' lucid cycles, and incense blends by the ton. The same pier can refuel 6 escort vessels in the time required to recertify 1 mass conveyor's septuple array. Under Munitorum Edict 9 Theta, escorts carrying troop cargo receive priority. The triage board writes virtue as color codes: green for doctrinally safe, amber for acceptable compromise, red for hope disguised as paperwork. The Adeptus Mechanicus monopolizes repair rights through guild structures treating technical knowledge as religious mystery requiring decades of initiation to comprehend. No other institution may touch Gellar generators without tech priest sanction, preserving quality while creating systematic bottlenecks. Forge temples produce certified components according to sacred STC templates that cannot be altered without heresy charges. When production quotas outstrip manufacturing capacity, the Mechanicus extends service intervals through administrative decree and assigns make-do litanies, blessing components beyond designed lifespans. Sacred geometry requirements prevent optimization. The septuple array's mathematical relationships cannot be modified without violating fundamental doctrine. Yet maintaining those relationships requires resources that war production cannot provide. Navigator houses husband their bloodlines like ammunition reserves. House ledgers list lucid intervals beside dowry negotiations, ship assignments alongside genealogical charts. Lady Navigator Corvax's 4th consecutive translation cycle without prescribed rest represents standard operating procedure when demand exceeds bloodline reproduction by exponential margins. The houses respond with incentives to cut recovery periods, stimulants to extend warp sight beyond safe limits, and contracts hedged with clauses indemnifying the houses when mines crack under pressure. The Administratum stamps these agreements because cargo must move regardless of individual cost. Everywhere, quotas convert caution into treason. A dockmaster refusing to clear amber-rated hulls risks censure for impeding war effort. An engine seer insisting on complete calibration loses position to colleagues signing variance approvals with greater efficiency. Form 77 Theta waivers multiply through bureaucratic systems designed to shift responsibility upward while enabling downward pressure. Each signature represents an office reviewing dangerous decisions while protecting individual decision-makers from consequences of collective policy. Black market supply networks exist because formal channels cannot meet demand generated by conflicts consuming resources faster than production replaces them. The contraband stabilizer aboard the Pilgrim represents systematic adaptation rather than isolated corruption. Factorum Tertius Omega operates under ecclesiarchy cover because clerical authority provides legal protection for manufacturing processes deviating from approved specifications. Heretic workshops throughout the sector sell harmonic smoothers to desperate engine seers, their products moving through supply chains, treating chemistry as theology. Contraband components reach ships wrapped in scarlet cloth, stitched with scripture, their invoices listing them as processional equipment, while specifications match no Navy catalogue. The septuple resonance array desynchronization pattern appears across incident logs with disturbing consistency, suggesting systematic rather than random failure. Archive analysis reveals identical harmonic drift signatures in vessels that never shared dockyards, cluster tertia, lagging when cannibalized parts mix manufacturing tolerances, quarter, overcorrecting when stabilizers spoof feedback systems, septima dropping from synchronization when modulators cross invisible age thresholds. The pattern repeats across hull classes, standardization creating predictability that becomes brittleness under resource constraints. Correcting this vulnerability would require retooling sacred ratios, rewriting fundamental rights, reprioritizing dock allocation, and relaxing quotas feeding hundreds of active war zones. None of these occur because the cure costs more than managing symptoms. Naval quarantine doctrine fits this machine like precision-cut gear, cold, exact, grinding. Omega-7 responses represent line items rather than catastrophes, patrol groups diverted here, intercepts plotted there, scuttle charges pre-armed, reports filed with observation that containment succeeded, and Vector was eliminated without planetary exposure. An inquisitorial white paper admits the correlation between warp incursions and elongated maintenance cycles, recommending raids on rogue factorums and exemplary scuttles to maintain discipline. It does not recommend slowing the war, because slowing the war means losing the war, and losing the war means losing everything. Every convoy becomes calculated risk, where acceptable loss percentages factor into strategic planning. The Pilgrim sailed with pending waiver because the supply line behind her could not afford her scruples. A world garrisons 8 regiments on rations arriving via 6 convoys, comprising 5 ships each. Lose 1 convoy, and the garrison starves. Lose 1 ship per convoy, and arithmetic still closes. Doctrine writes acceptable loss into sailing orders with mathematical precision that treats individual vessels as consumable resources rather than reusable assets. This creates the fundamental system architecture. Failure is normal, contained by ritual and fire rather than prevented through adequate resource allocation. The result represents design rather than accident, systematic acceptance of preventable failure because prevention costs exceed replacement in calculations measuring souls against strategic objectives. Individual tragedies become acceptable statistics when aggregated across scales, where sector survival outweighs ship preservation. The moral inversion emerges through institutional logic that transforms hope from rescue into discipline. Hope aboard an Imperial vessel is not salvation approaching from outside, but the ability to perform correct actions faster than fear can paralyze. It becomes the discipline to maintain function while systems fail, to accept sacrifice as service rather than tragedy, to choose who dies so others might live when doctrine demands impossible decisions in seconds that determine fates of thousands. Rumor becomes policy's shadow when institutions cannot publish truths about rationed safety. Crews teach survival techniques through folklore, because official channels provide only silence and sealed files. The grandmother rhythm survives because it works. Salt lines persist because they prevent condensate creep. Saints' medals quiver at appropriate frequencies. Confessors permit helpful traditions while eliminating dangerous speculation. Magi incorporate successful folk techniques and claim they were always canonical. Everyone understands. No one documents it officially. The invisible war operates through accumulated compromises, appearing reasonable within immediate contexts, while creating systematic vulnerabilities across strategic scales. Each decision compounds into conditions, making catastrophic failure inevitable rather than merely possible, transforming individual choices into collective policy through processes protecting decision-makers while endangering those affected by their decisions. Resource scarcity drives technological heresy, as necessity forces deviation from approved procedures, creating markets for contraband components functioning adequately while violating spiritual compliance requirements. Policy will not change for individual convenience, but practice adapts within constraints that cannot be officially acknowledged. In the darkness between stars, practice becomes the only mercy the Imperium can afford, not optimism, but clarity about what survival actually costs and what it actually requires from those who must pay that price daily. What do we tell those who will depart tonight with pending waivers, cut incense, overextended navigators, and cargo holds containing components whose provenance traces through networks that officially do not exist? Creed becomes survival manual rather than consolation when hope transforms into discipline, and discipline becomes the only barrier between duty and despair in arithmetic that prices souls against strategic necessity, with mathematical precision that admits no appeals to sentiment or mercy. The ledger balances. The war continues, the ships depart, the hum holds, honest in its imperfection, trustworthy in its admission of damage sustained and prices paid. Tomorrow brings new waivers, new compromises, new calculations written in lives that round to acceptable numbers in margins, where individuals become statistics and statistics become policy. Return to the candle in the sanctum. Tech Adept Vex 77 pinches the flame between wetted fingers, not blown, never blown, because breath carries moisture, and moisture fouls contacts in systems traumatized by recent failure. The wick dies with dignity, smoke pressed flat against adamantine ribs by invisible pressure that speaks of field generators laboring to maintain their ragged song. This is the last thing a ship can offer its people before translation. Not comfort, but instruction. Not hope, but method. The Pilgrim of Sorrow breathes with survivor's rhythm. Rather than the confident pulse of the untested, her Gellar field honest in its imperfection, trustworthy in its admission of damage sustained and prices paid. Close the open loops with cold precision. Authority will choose erasure over rescue when contamination threatens to spread beyond acceptable parameters. The coded phrase, containment compromised, protocol Omega-7 initiated, triggers protocols older than individual command authority, transforming desperate pleas into threat assessments, requiring management through established procedures. Squadron Tertius approaches with weapons charged. Because doctrine assumes prevention costs less than cure when measured across populations whose survival depends on maintaining barriers between ordered space and the appetite that waits beyond. Survivors will be managed, not celebrated, through systems prioritizing collective safety over individual recognition. Their continued existence proves problematic because survival itself becomes evidence of potential corruption when exposure should have resulted in death or madness. Processing transforms heroes into liabilities requiring containment through channels that preserve valuable skills while eliminating dangerous knowledge, ensuring Imperial efficiency continues while contamination risks receive appropriate management. This is your creed, not consolation, but survival manual, written in the cold language of those who have learned that discipline matters more than hope when physics goes on strike, and doctrine must be spoken faster than fear can think. Keep the hum in memory. Learn the 23.7 Hz resonance through teeth and tongue until deviation registers before instruments lie. The field's rhythm becomes your heartbeat, its roughness preferable to deceptive smoothness that masks dangerous fluctuations beneath artificial perfection. When notes pull, long or short without intention, trust flesh over glass. Auspex loves averages. The warp loves edges. Your Rosarius beads warm against chest when electromagnetic variance bleeds through superstructure. Believe the sensation before any dial admits deviation. Count by touch, quarter turns of phase wheels, measured in clicks, never freehand, always counted aloud with response lines using syllables predecessors used. Ritual makes human error predictable, and predictable error can be planned for when planning becomes the difference between containment and catastrophe. When visibility fails and memory fractures under pressure, augmetic fingers guide you through prescribed sequences that keep timing synchronized when seconds measure in blood. Prefer bolts to songs when securing what matters. Straight lines resist improvisation better than curves. Proper torque specifications hold when geometry tries to negotiate. Chalk marks travel less in the eye, less in the mind during thin time, when corridors express opinions about their destinations. Salt lines at thresholds dry condensate that creeps along seams and bridges contacts. Practical function disguised as superstition. Engineering preserved through folklore when official channels provide only silence and sealed files. Never stand alone in a corridor that bends without structural justification. Buddy chains ensure witnesses when reality becomes negotiable. Ward prayers recited continuously provide psychic anchors. Emergency incense protocols create electromagnetic barriers, slowing intrusion effects. If the chalk marks crawl, repaint them without watching too closely. If shadows pool against the light, do not put your hand in them to prove points that do not matter when surfaces do. Believe enough to be predictable to your machine spirit. but never enough to stop checking readings with fingers that detect temperature variations instruments might miss. Machine spirits appreciate consistency over enthusiasm. They respond to reliable ritual rather than passionate improvisation. Faith becomes metronome rather than melody, steady timing that keeps procedures synchronized when the tri-seal authorization requires signatures applied within breaths of each other, while catastrophe accelerates beyond human control. Distrust smooth readings that suggest perfection in systems designed to admit honest limitations. Imperial technology operates with characteristic roughness, proving function rather than merely appearing functional. The contraband stabilizer promised efficiency through elimination of harmonic variations that indicated healthy system function. Smoothness became suspicious to experienced operators who understand that authentic performance includes variations rather than artificial consistency. Know the braid of authority before you need it. The cold start litany requires tri-seal from captain, magos, and confessor, applied faster than doctrine typically permits when reality dissolves around command. Structure. Authority braided like wire, strong, inflexible, fatally slow to unkink when seconds bleed like arterial wounds. Practice opening cabinets with gloves and blood on hands. Clear corridors ahead of time. The words must be right the first time, because there is no second time when the membrane tears and time turns viscous. If ordered to jettison, close your eyes and pull. The arithmetic of empire requires choosing who dies, so others might live, when doctrine demands impossible decisions in seconds, determining fates of thousands. 32 souls become numbers in ledgers that balance individual tragedy against collective survival. Their sacrifice recorded as equipment loss rather than personnel casualty. Red Corridor 19 appears on damage control schematics as expendable volume. Write the names you are allowed. Remember the ones you are not. Write temperatures and frequencies without rounding. Sign with the name you have today, even if the ship decides tomorrow that you never served here. The administratum will smooth your angles. The ledger will make your corridor into cargo. Keep a second ledger in your mouth. Pass it to the next pair of hands with the tool roll. Sister Vex Corina weeps without reportable cause for someone who officially never existed, but whose absence tears holes in memory like shrapnel through silk. The septuple resonance array desynchronization pattern appears across multiple incident logs, cluster tertia lagging, quarter overcorrecting, septima refusing diagnostic queries. The pattern repeats because sacred geometry requirements prevent optimization, while resource constraints force components beyond designed lifespans. Correcting this vulnerability would require retooling sacred ratios, rewriting fundamental rights, reprioritizing dock allocation, none of which occur because the cure costs more than managing symptoms. Do not pray for rescue. Rescue in the lexicon of empire means quarantine, and quarantine means fire that blooms without accusation when naval doctrine treats every warp-compromised vessel as potential plague ship, regardless of apparent recovery. Pray for discernment. Pray for hands that do not shake while they sign. Pray for discipline to perform correct actions faster than fear can list alternatives. Hope is not salvation approaching from outside, but discipline to do the right thing faster than fear when the membrane tears and authority must choose violence over procedure. This is clarity, not hope. You serve a civilization that survives by refusing spectacle and accounting for the dead as numbers in margins, where individuals become statistics and statistics become policy. The Imperium functions on rationed knowledge, as carefully distributed as blessed oils. Information flows through established channels, treating ignorance as protection when curiosity kills more surely than compliance. Every convoy becomes calculated risk, where acceptable loss percentages factor into strategic planning, treating vessels as consumable resources rather than reusable assets. The field will fail again, because failure is normal, contained by ritual and fire rather than prevented through adequate resource allocation. Tomorrow brings new waivers, new compromises, new calculations written in lives that round to acceptable numbers. The ships depart because delay costs more than acceptable risk, when strategic necessity spans sectors whose survival depends on cargo reaching destinations, regardless of individual cost. Practice becomes the only mercy the Imperium can afford, not optimism, but clarity about what survival actually costs. The grandmother rhythm survives because it teaches lungs to notice harmonic drift. Salt lines persist because they prevent condensate creep. Saints' medals quiver at frequencies indicating field instability. Rumor preserves practical knowledge when official channels fail, encoding survival techniques through folklore that works despite contradicting approved procedures. In the sanctum, relight the candle only when pressure settles. Check seals you can see. Assume ones you cannot are cracked. Behave as if both are true. Replace incense canisters with those that leave your tongue heavy. Clean your tools. Oil what knows your hand. Mark the mesh where the moth burned it, so you can tell if the mark moves tomorrow. The candle gutters and is pinched, not blown, smoke pressed flat by invisible pressure that speaks of generators laboring to maintain their honest song. The hum returns to pitch, ragged and therefore true, reliable in its admission of limitations, rather than promising impossible perfection. The field holds, a membrane of borrowed sanity, stretched taut around human cargo, maintained by habit and hazard in equal measure. For now, it is enough, until it is not. The ship breathes, the ledger balances, the arithmetic continues, credits roll over ash, and the mathematics of empire, where individual candles carried across vast rooms by tired hands prove sufficient when measured against the appetite that waits beyond the light.